Extreme heat made record-breaking numbers this past summer. Now, some of us were maybe able to go inside and cool off with a nice AC, but what about those who don't have AC? What about those who are working outside all day and are unprotected? What about those who are unhoused and can't find a cooling facility? Now, we often associate impacts with climate change, such as extreme heat, flooding, hurricanes, rising sea levels, and many more. But what happens when we talk about those impacts on vulnerable populations? That's called climate justice. Climate justice is a movement that was focused on the global south and carbon emissions and has transformed where thousands have taken action to be able to address these inequities. Now, we often take a look at the amazing activists throughout time and history, and I often wonder how, what, and wow. But what if I told you that you can be part of this movement? That you can be part of this narrative to make a more inclusive climate justice movement yourself. Together, let's reconnect and amplify the voices of those who have been most impacted by climate change through storytelling. My name's Alyssa Wentzel. I'm 21 years old, and I'm a climate activist and researcher. I have a story. I have a story that when I would go to my local community center, I would see this giant landfill every time I passed by, and in the summer months, it would just get rancid. I have a story that when I would go to my neighboring town, I would see the Limerick power plant, and I wonder, these big puffy clouds, what is this doing for our environment and climate? I have a story that when I would have to go to school or to work, I would see flooding occurring, and there would be this bridge that I had to access just to get there. And in the midst of these heavy flooding events, I wonder, how am I going to get to school today? Or I wonder, these houses that are lining the Schuylkill River, what's going to happen to them? So these experiences and these stories that I have faced personally, I wanted to be able to amplify those who may have faced similar or those who have faced worse. Now, everybody has stories with climate change, but there have been voices that have been silenced through time and history due to oppression and discrimination. But how do we identify who those voices are? Climate change vulnerability can be assessed by race, ethnicity, gender, class, ability, and many more. Furthermore, these social identities can then intersect to form an experience called intersectionality, which identifies new forms of oppression. Now, the lens of intersectionality is so critical because we're able to identify experiences that might have not been told. And furthermore, we can then use that lens to be able to include communities in the midst of planning and mitigation. So, how do we do that? How are we able to use this lens in an inclusive, accessible way? We need to storytell. We need to, 1, share, 2, take action, and 3, believe. So the first step is to share. How many of you are familiar with the state of Delaware? Put those hands up. How many of you are familiar with cities or towns within Delaware, such as Wilmington or Newark? Okay, good bunch. Now, how many of you are familiar with communities and neighborhoods in Delaware, such as Southbridge or the Route 9 corridor? So I mentioned Delaware not only because we're in Delaware in this very moment, but for you to recognize that these communities are in our backyards and are facing the brunt of impacts related to climate change. Now, these communities in Delaware have been mobilizing to create a movement in order to have their voices heard and to advocate for climate-just legislation and laws in order to ensure a more healthy and sustainable future. So through my time at the University of Delaware, I've learned about the Southbridge community and its phases of impacts with flooding. And I wonder, when that flooding and being sited near a facility, is that pollution entering in their homes? I've learned about the stories that the Route 9 corridor faces, and I think about the unjust pollution, and then I furthermore think about heat exhaustion and how that exacerbates heat exhaustion. So I also think about how many people in Delaware are just unhoused, and I wonder what happens to them in the midst of a climate disaster. It's important and critical to share in a meaningful, inclusive way to have these stories out there and for them to be on the table. But what do we do with these stories? What's next? We need to believe. So I want you to imagine yourself, you're in your house, right? And something's different. You don't have power. You haven't had power for 3 days. And furthermore, your food, your water, everything is different. You go into your fridge because you're hungry and there's no food. You go to your sink then next, because that's the next best option to get some water, and you turn on the water and it's brown. You have some water bottles, that are plastic, but there's only so much of them. Furthermore, you're probably thinking, why can't you just go outside and go into the outdoors and go to the nearest grocery store that happens to be a mile away? But let's think. There's a flooding event going on. You can't leave your home. Can you imagine that? Can you put yourself in that situation? Climate change is here. This is a climate crisis, and believing means empathizing, to understand and validate that these stories are here and that they are real. We need to believe the stories of the brunt of the hurricane impacting renters. We need to believe the stories of flooding being a pervasive issue in the communities of Wilmington. We need to believe how rising sea levels are surging and are affecting the coast of Delaware and Sussex County in particular, and those without flood insurance. We need to believe the cases of extreme heat and even people dying from it. We need to believe these stories to validate them. But what's after that? The last step that we need to take is action. So I mentioned organizations and climate activists and community members in Delaware because they, besides all odds, have been doing long-standing work to make sure that their voice is heard and that their community concerns are there. However, we are lacking through government and academia to make a reach to be able to understand these stories. We need resources to these communities and for them to be heard. So I work in a climate research lab with Dr. Rebecca Nixon and Amalia Castillo, where we've been using this intersectional climate lens in order to amplify the voices of LGBTQ people of color in the Mid-Atlantic. Through this research, we've been able to use qualitative research in order to understand the experiences that community members, activists have been facing. And so not only are we doing this in order to kind of come to some sort of conclusion of underlying themes, but we're also doing it because we need to amplify these voices to make sure that their voices are here and that they're understood. So when people are suffering, when people are hurting, when people are thinking about whether they're going to have heat, AC, electricity, food in their bellies, just remember, this is all in relation to climate. As you go home today, I want you to turn to your neighbor, turn to your friend, turn to your loved one, turn to whoever, and ask them about their experiences with climate change. Ask them about their experiences with particularly like climate and the environment. Has it been positive? Has it been negative? Maybe ask why. If we can implement little moves of climate justice into our daily activities, we can help form a broader picture. Together, we can amplify these voices and build a more inclusive climate justice movement. Thank you.